Hello and welcome back to my reflections on English 333, History of the Book. And today I'm going to be talking about the expansion of print, which is our third unit. And let's just get into it. So for my first question of these guiding questions for these recordings is, who is printing and how are they represented in their products? This is a really important unit, as in this period, specifically post-16th century, we see authors really being connected to their works kind of for the first time, the idea of kind of authorship being a big part of book culture, print culture, etc. In the class, we looked at collected, this idea of kind of collected works under an author, like Shakespeare's collected works or Chaucer's collected works, to look at this topic. And we also talked about the idea of authors' portraits and authors, kind of, not authors' notes, but we looked at that kind of Ben Jonson write-up on Shakespeare, which included that kind of discussion that it was below the author portrait of William Shakespeare that said, like, well, we can't give you, this is obviously paraphrasing, but because even though this portrait doesn't give you who Shakespeare was in life, it doesn't give you his wit, doesn't give you kind of who he was as a person, hopefully reading his collected works will. And I think that's just a really interesting idea of reading the author through their words, through their text, which is such an important and kind of integral part of how we approach reading today. And this idea of authorship and the author being read through their work is such a key, I would say key part of how we approach writing now. I feel like we think of the author as kind of as like either as important as the text or just an essential part of the text, and seeing it emerge in this period is quite interesting. And another aspect of kind of who is printing and the way they're represented in their products is that we also see printers or publishers really asserting the authenticity or the completeness of their work when we look at these collected works of famous authors in like the English canon is what we looked at, and looking at this kind of importance of asserting your authenticity to kind of create a uniqueness or a value in your work that's really new in this period and comes along with this idea of the collected works and the author, which are all just such important parts of how we see print today. And they really emerge in this expansion of print kind of period, as I said, post-16th century specifically. And I think that those really stand out when I look back over my notes and look back over the course when I reflect on it. For the question of who is reading and what do books mean to them as objects, I'm going to start with when we looked at the Thine Chaucer collection. And one of the things that was brought up in class was this the fact that it includes a glossary, because now people aren't able to read Chaucer in the way that they would have in the last period we looked at. Now Chaucer, I believe the phrase was used was is ancient now. His work is no longer kind of part of the current vernacular of how people speak English, and so you really need a glossary to understand and notes on how to read these texts. And I think that's really interesting because, as I mentioned in the very first one of these recordings, we looked at how people were starting to write English glosses above Latin on manuscripts. And I think this is kind of the evolution of that, the kind of switch from texts being kind of very traditional and very classic and very stagnant in not changing with their kind of localities, and people needing to put in their vernacular, to now having vernacular texts where people are supported by the text themselves in their reading, and it's helping them read. It kind of connects to that idea that I feel like I've mentioned in several of these recordings now of the scripto continuum that we looked at in the very first unit. Assumes that you already know the text to be able to read, where instead here we see the text helping and supporting new readers of the text by providing glossaries on what these different older English words mean, and helping a reader be able to read these kind of members of the canon. I also wanted to talk about how, for the question of like who is reading and what do kind of books mean to them and beyond, we looked a little bit in this unit at this idea of kind of the return or the continuation of private kind of scribal circulation, and like why people would write down their own pieces of text, either copy them into their own small books, just pieces of text, or why you would still see handwritten pieces over print, and that's part of the regulations on print and part of the way that print was restricted, and this real acknowledgement in this period of kind of the danger that print presents in its ability to spread ideas. We also talked in this unit about Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, and how the story itself kind of has this like acknowledgement of the ability of print to spread ideas. In that case, I believe Catholic ones, which are seen as kind of dangerous, and that's quite important as the expansion of print really kind of intersects with the Reformation and such. Finally, I also wanted to talk about how this is also the period in which we talked about the reference book emerging. So reference books being everything from books of maps to anatomy textbooks to bestiaries, etc. And how the emergence of the reference book in this period is also kind of tells us about who is reading. Not only because we see like these reference books being used for personal practice, like say an anatomy text might be used by a doctor or students to become a doctor, but also kind of, and I'm going to get into this in the next section too, but how these are now books that could belong to collectors, because we see the development of the kind of idea of the cabinet of curiosities, or even more, especially as we get into the 18th century, this idea of having kind of like a studio or a study full of different interesting objects to discuss with people who come and visit. These gentlemanly cabinet of curiosities exactly tell us, it is quite interesting because this is an example of if you were going to have one of these reference books kind of to have as part of your cabinet of curiosities, that shows the book not moving from something that's just being read also to becoming more of an object and an acknowledgement of the book as an object and what it symbolizes. It reminds me of like modern coffee table books, which are not really for reading or for looking at. And I think that's really interesting because something that's really fascinated me throughout this course, and I'm going to talk about it again in a second, is how we moved to now seeing when we preserve books in like a museum or in even a library with like a special collection of older books, we think of these books as kind of, we're preserving them in time, we're freezing them, we're not doing anything to them anymore. All we're doing is just trying to preserve them in the state in which they began being preserved. Whatever year we started preserving them in, they need to stay in that state for perpetuity. And that's so important to kind of curatorial practice now and how we see that. And I wonder if the beginnings of keeping these kind of reference books in, to use the phrase again, the cabinet of curiosities in your personal collection to show off, is maybe where we start to see these kind of inklings of this kind of preservationist ideology, even though we still see people, as I'm about to speak about, altering books in this period and trying to make and really not preserving them. But this idea of preserving books as kind of these physical spectacles, I wonder if it eventually kind of evolves into what we see today as modern curatorial practice. So as I've been alluding to, I also want to talk about how we interact with kind of historical book objects and how do we view them as like modern readers, or just how do we kind of, and in this question, I want to also look at just the historical book object and kind of preservation, and in this unit, we read the article Special Collections, Book Curatorship, and the Idea of Early Print in Libraries by Jeffrey Todd Knight, which talked about a variety of things. But one of the things that stood out to me, even though it was just kind of a small part of the reading, and I think it's just because I've looked at it in other areas of study, like art history, was this idea that kind of collectors or booksellers of older books in this period would cut down pages or bleach them to try and make them look new, or all these different process, or rebind these books to make them look older, or just try and make books look like they're brand new for sale or collection, rather than, which is so different than our modern practice of curatorship, where books are preserved pristinely in their original copy. If they're modern books made out of wood pulp, we like put all the acid-free paper around them and we try and deacidify them to try and keep them in their original state. Whereas these people were actively damaging the books themselves with no like idea of the sanctity of the book, and not damaging it or not altering it. And I just think it's really interesting because I'm so curious about when this real shift happened to kind of a preservationist attitude around how we approach the historical book object, and I think it's really interesting. I also wanted to note that in the night reading also mentions that William Pooh, who we talked about in in this category, in this unit, was a highly inefficient cataloger because he was over detailed and got too interested in the books he was what the books were about, and these catalogs were like multiple pages long, which is not super efficient for cataloging a massive library. But the reading talked a little bit about how those really detailed catalogs have become quite useful to modern readers when those older texts he was cataloging are no longer available because they've been lost, or we don't have much information on them stored, or we don't have the kind of same memory around the book. I just think that's really interesting how a methodology for cataloging or curatorship that was really inefficient in its time, and I mean would still be considered inefficient today, but kind of to me seems like a kind of beginning of this kind of idea of like collecting all the information on a text if you're preserving a historical text, really being careful about not losing any of that information for posterity, and that's just really kind of fascinating to me. Finally, I want to look at this question of how do we imagine kind of the arc of print history, and like what are the terms on which we approach it. And I think it's just interesting because, as I've mentioned at the top of this this reflection, this is the unit where we really see the beginnings of and development of our modern conceptions of bookishness and authorship, and kind of, as we saw in our class, the publishing of Shakespeare's work when it was being published, and we talked about all the different kinds of documents and papers that they were probably pulled together from like the author's personal notes or cue books for actors in plays, that the idea of like the auteur had barely emerged in this period. And it's just in this kind of what this unit is, in this unit of like the expansion of print and the kind of years it covers, we really see the kind of beginnings of how we see the modern author, and like what the modern author looks like, and how we like conceptualize reading and just that idea. And I think that that's quite a unique and significant one of the key parts and concepts from this unit, is this beginning of like the idea of authorship and how we see the author in relation to their text. I also wanted to mention just briefly for this how do we imagine print history, because I want to talk about how I think that print, as we've looked at it in this class, it never exists, kind of as I said in another recording, in a vacuum. We never see it separate from like other movements in history or different industries, etc. We talked in this unit, when we were talking about reference books, we talked about the Mercator projection and just mapping in general. And it's just interesting because like, and we talked about how these map books kind of emerged at the beginning of this period of kind of as colonial exploits into like the New World were really happening in Europe, is kind of simultaneous with this like development of maps and maps as reference books. It's just really interesting to me because in my first year of university at UBC, I took a human geography course, and we started looking at portraits of map makers and explorers, which would often have some of these kind of actually pictures from reference books. They'd have like reference books of maps laid out on like a desk next to the person in the portrait, and how the idea of kind of mapping the world is a predecessor to kind of claiming the world. Because if you can draw the world, if you can conceptualize it, that's like an act of kind of colonial claiming on it. To be able to capture it, both in the capture it literally, but also capture it in the visual representation. And it's just really interesting, and it's just a point that was made in this class about the Mercator projection and how it makes the northern hemisphere larger and therefore seem more significant. It's just something that stood out to me and that I wanted to add to this reflection. Finally, my little animation for this section shows two little reference books on a stack and some floating around images of a constellation, because we see like astronomy books in this unit in this period, and also a little map. I know it's not the Mercator projection; it's just a globe, but I liked my little globe, and so those are just floating around there to represent some of the kind of things that happen in this expansion of print unit. That's all for me on this reflection, and I'll see you next time for mass printing. Thanks.